So first of all, thanks everyone for being here on a Monday morning to talk about next-gen manufacturing, or I would really prefer to just say manufacturing because that is how I think a lot of these things should be done. We have with us here three founders in what we would call the broad theme of rebuilding the American industrial base. So we have Jordan Black from Senra Systems, Chris Power from Hadrian, and Brian Hargis from Castellion. I'll let each of them introduce what each of their companies is making and how they see themselves fitting into the industrial base. But let's have them take it away. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Jordan, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about what Senra is making, and how wire harnesses are important to the industrial base.
Seal this. Hi everyone, I'm Jordan Black, CEO of Senra Systems. We design and manufacture wire harnesses, and probably everyone in this room is asking themselves, what the hell is a wire harness? Just think of it as like an iPhone charger, but really, really, really complex, very manual and labor-intensive thing to manufacture, 25% of the cost of your car, and almost every company hates building it. What we're doing is really interesting because as the labor shortage starts to increase and wire harnesses are more needed for like the electrification of vehicles, it's really, really critical that we improve like the industrial supply chain, especially if it's commodity good.
Awesome. Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about Hadrian?
We build autonomous factories for aerospace and defense, primarily because to compete with China, you want to be as cheap as them, as efficient, except with automation and technology, not slave labor. So we are a vertically integrated manufacturing software company where the product that you get is either a factory or a bunch of high-precision components that go on space defense vehicles. But really, we're a manufacturer masquerading as a software company, like fully vertically integrated.
And Brian, you want to tell us a little bit about Castellion and the hypersonics landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming. If everybody was this interested in manufacturing, I guess we'd be in a different spot in America, so thanks for coming on a Monday morning. And it is true about wiring harnesses. There's probably nobody that has not had to buy a wiring harness has ever thought about that, because you just take it for granted. Like my device has a wiring harness. But at Castellion, we are actually developing hypersonic weapon systems, and I'll get into a bit why, because that's kind of an aggressive statement. But kind of like national power stems from, kind of like central cores, whether it's economic, cultural, industrial, as well as military strength. And unfortunately, what's been happening for a long time is the U.S. has actually been falling behind in terms of like new capabilities in defense, and specifically with defense manufacturing, because it's not just enough to have like the best technology, which the U.S. typically does do a good job at, of having the absolute best of something, but our ability to actually manufacture it at scale at a cost that even the government, who's running tremendous deficits, can even afford, has been a critical issue for as long as I've been in a professional capacity, which was a long time ago. I'm probably the oldest. I don't know. Maybe you're the oldest. We'll get into that later. But long time. And, Mr. Wizard was on TV when I grew up. But the main thing is, if you're going to have like actual strategic deterrence against China, and we're talking like there's like levels of deterrence, there's nuclear deterrence, there's economic deterrence, which is what we're currently using to like prevent them from unifying Taiwan. We're working on something in the middle, a non-nuclear strategic deterrent, and a hypersonic weapon is a great way to do that. Strength is all about actually ability to project force to hopefully not actually use the weapon. So none of us at Castellion actually hope to use what we're building, but by the very fact that the U.S. has it, actually acts as a deterrent. So that's what we are building.
Thank you, Brian. So why don't we start with the state of affairs in the present? And I know all of you have a lot of thoughts about this. So can we start with, in a single word, how would each of you describe the state of American manufacturing in your respective domains?
Let me think about this one. Just from like a political standpoint, just that American manufacturing in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be a single word because I know that's a tall ask for something like this. But yeah, just expand on kind of like how you see the state of affairs right now in your field.
I think right now, especially with what we're doing, like I think the one word answer is like complex. I think manufacturing is just death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it's also just really, really overlooked. I've been in manufacturing for a while, and I was kind of the kid that was made fun of in college to work at the plants at Ford. And it's like, why aren't you behind the computer designing brackets or anything really cool and exciting? And now it's really amazing that we're kind of making it sexy again. So I think we're in the up and up because world needs more and more hardware. But overall, it's just like it's the most complex thing, and it's from not only processes, raw materials, the design of it, but I think it's the most exciting but also challenging problem ever because it gets down to bits and atoms, and you can only make something so cheap or so fast, and you kind of need the world's greatest minds working on it. So you look at a company like SpaceX, and it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to develop something that amazing. And so I think we are in a really, exciting pivotal point in the next few years of like where hardware is kind of coming back. But I think the one word answer is complex and challenging.
Chris, I know you have a lot of thoughts about the history of American manufacturing and how we got to where we are. Because I think, Jordan, you're right that, and I fully agree that we are on the up as far as the cultural change that needs to happen to make manufacturing more robust and more resilient. But for a while there, and I would say we're not out of the woods yet by any stretch of the imagination. So I love to understand, Chris, your thoughts on like how we got to where we are, how we got to the point where we need to actually fix these problems, and like what you see as the road that took us here.
Yeah, am I allowed to swear, by the way, or?
It's probably fine.
All right.
Fuck yeah.
Find out.
So to Brian's point, financial power is a bad proxy for military power, and military power is ultimately a bad proxy for industrial power. So basically the story is we kicked ass in World War II in the 1920s because we were really good at domestic manufacturing. We pivoted all to the industrial base. We kicked the shit out of everyone else. Even though we had worse technology, we just built more of everything. We just outbuilt everybody. And what ends up happening over multiple generations is it's like real estate traders forgetting that market crashes exists. And the reason why real estate market crashes happen is because there's a bunch of 27-year-olds that don't know the anxiety of losing their shirt. And then everyone keeps clicking the buy button and it all falls apart. And that happens over multiple generations, right? So what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is we were so wealthy that that generation who ended up doing a lot of financial engineering, and you can talk about this with baby boomers with houses, or you can talk about this with like cocaine New York, was we stretched the rubber band really far to spreadsheets and super far away from reality, and started using the big stick of financial warfare and weaponry, and that became like a lot of America. The problem with that is it's like being, Mike Tyson in your 50s, but you've got some like brain disease that you believe you're still 25, right? So what happens is everyone operates like we're still the industrial superpower, and we're making really poor decisions because of it. But this happens to every great company, nation. It's like IBM used to just make the best products, and now they're just a process company where everyone's filling out documents and no one really knows what the hell is going on. That just happens to countries and people as well, and it's largely because you're so successful, you get abstracted away from reality, and then you forget. Like, the roads aren't getting paved. Like, how did that happen? Well, this is like how it goes. So the current state is like bad for many reasons. One is like people in the government or people in power have not updated their mental models that we are like super close to retiring age and still picking bar fights with 22-year-olds. It's a really, really bad idea. And then on the practical side, it's like, I'm assuming everyone's close to software here. It's like trying to wave a magic wand and saying, we have no software engineers in this country at all. Someone's going to start OpenAI. And from a talent perspective, right? And you don't get really good AI researchers without having millions and millions and millions of software engineers that train each other and build on top of these abstraction layers and the whole industry gets better like over a long period of time. And that's kind of where manufacturing's at, which is why nothing's coming out of those Intel plants for semiconductors for like a decade, because you can't just wave a magic wand and push yourself up to the top of the abstraction stack. And it really all is a cultural problem. I mean, you can ask the question, like, why are we so behind on shipbuilding? One big answer is, like, no one cares and there's bad government incentives. The other answer is, like, leadership, like, doesn't really know anything about shipbuilding. The workforce kind of forgot to care because it's been unimportant for such a long time. But the rate of what we can produce things in this country for defense or space or anything outside of very rare companies like SpaceX is, like, several orders of magnitude worse than the public believe or the government believe, and our adversaries know that, which is why they're just pushing and keep boiling the frog. Because here's an example. In most war game scenarios, if a carrier fleet went across Taiwan and we had to ship a bunch of missiles over there and fire them, our entire inventory of every munition in the country would last 3 days. And then it would take us 3 years to replace it. That's how bad it is. There are many answers on how to solve this, but like that's kind of like the main story here. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this financialization piece that led to a lot of abstraction with the kind of these like with real world power, and then there's the culture piece, which is related, and these are mutually reinforcing. I'm curious. We see a lot of headlines about things like SpaceX's like the environmental hurdles that SpaceX gets put in front of them. Or Jordan, we had shared this tweet that we saw about how wire harnesses in airplane seatbacks were constantly breaking, and they cost like $10,000 a piece to replace because of an FAA approval process. I'm curious, like, how does regulation play into the state of affairs in making these things, and how does that affect costs, timelines, things like that?
Yeah, I think it kind of like you kind of look at history where we had to build one or two or a lower quantity of like planes or missiles or anything like that, and we had all these like crazy requirements, and just no one is the one taking a stance at any of these big primes saying we really should stop doing that. It's like trying to do an X-ray test on every single burger that comes out of it in and out. Like that's kind of like how I would put the analogy together. And so with all this FAA, like if I going like really specific, like probably every one of those wire harnesses, there's probably some, just to be very frank, old white guy who comes to that shop and like inspects it for 3 hours and then makes sure it goes in a plane, versus like a shop like ours doesn't necessarily need it because we have a lot of automation and process to do that. And so you can provide a better solution to these companies, and no one is actually saying, okay, we should probably lower the cost, lead time, the quality, anything like that too. Overall, I think just these companies aren't getting the pressure, and so there's this new age of like companies like Anduril coming in the space where like now I think the aerospace and defense primes are starting to get a little pressure of like, okay, we have to kind of step our game up too. So I think hopefully in 5-10 years there will be cheaper wire harnesses, and hopefully Senra Systems is the one making it. But that is a ludicrous cost, and I think just no one's actually waving the finger. Yeah, and Brian, I want to turn to you for a second because Chris and Jordan are kind of building companies that are expanding our manufacturing capabilities of things that exist today, and at the end that we are making just in like a horribly inefficient and cost ineffective way. What you're building is actually in many ways like a net new capability for the country, and I'm curious, like, do you see any differences in making something that is net new in that way versus making things that exist in a far better way?
Yeah. So I'm going to actually build off of the previous question and get to the new one, Oliver. So when you look at like not only just regulation, but like how do you do aerospace engineering? Like if you're going to answer that, like why is it that like traditional companies and like especially Boeing right now is really just eating it hard? Like why is it going so poorly for them, and why is like the regulatory environment so harsh? My opinion is like what's happened over time is like with any like process or experience, like eventually something goes wrong, somebody makes a bad decision, and they replace that bad decision with process to basically accommodate the lowest common denominator. So it's like you just go to like, so if all your decisions is like making process so that you can't do anything innovative, you can't move fast because there's a presumption that you might screw it up, which is always true when you do anything, you end up going incredibly slow because you just layered on process, and now that's as good as you are the lowest common denominator, and that's what we have done to ourselves as a country, both on the regulatory front. It's also what like traditional aerospace has done to themselves, you know, in terms of like how they do their internal engineering culture. And so when you ask like, why is like traditional aerospace so awful at like developing new capabilities with outside of certain exceptions like SpaceX and some other newer companies? Well, it's because they have 50 years of process they've layered on top of themselves that has literally killed their ability to innovate and to move affordably and to build at scale. And this just happens with age unless you actively work to keep it out. And that's the main issue. So like when you ask, is there anything like different about doing something new? Well, I mean, there's a little bit more unknowns, but honestly, if you go about it with that same traditional process that's just like layered bureaucracy, it's going to go horribly. And so the most important thing, whether you're building a wiring harness or whether you're doing something new, is you look at like not only like you got to build out your culture of your team and how you make decisions, and how do you not layer on process that basically turns everybody from an individual who has like skills and the ability to make a mistake to just like paper pushing. You have to look at that at every level. And in regulatory, it's the same way. Like it's not unreasonable that the FAA wants to keep people safe from something falling on their head, but it is unreasonable to take like 180 days. Like that's holding the progress of the country. We have to do better than that. But like there's a process that they put in place because at some point somewhere somebody made a bad decision. And that's unfortunate.
The other thing is that it's like if you filled your company with lawyers, nothing's going to get done because everyone wants to keep their job. And like now every report coming up to the CEO is like, look how many legal compliance processes I put in place. So one of the reasons why people are absolutely correct about government overspending is because if you have regulatory agencies with thousands of people, they get promoted by like blocking stuff. The incentive system is like just super fucked all over the place.
That's 100% true.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody gets, like, it's rare you get promoted because, like, hey, I did a good thing and I saved money. Like, especially with, this is like really bizarre with the government. If you don't spend all the money that you were given that year, they literally give you less as punishment next year. So, you, like, what incentive structure is that? Like, you shouldn't be punished for doing a good job one year. You should be like, let me tack that on to next year and I can do more so that, like, good program managers get to do more. And instead the incentives drive everything, and your company culture drives like your ability to, you know, get things done internally. We spend so much time thinking like, how do we prevent like becoming what we're complaining about? And it's not easy because like just things creep in constantly. You have to look at everything with a like an unbiased opinion of like, why are we making this decision? Why are we putting in place this process? And is it more damaging than what it's supposedly fixing?
Yeah. I think what people miss about SpaceX is like, and you can override me here, but I think people miss that a big chunk of the value of vertical integration is just not dealing with a bunch of regulatory things with a bajillion different sub-tier suppliers or processes or whatever.
Oh, it's 100% true. Like if you build a product and you've put in place like 1,000 legal contracts with all your suppliers that have been negotiated, God, untold number of
someone's building
hours.
The engine and fucking someone's building the wing.
And then you're like, you determine later from an engineering perspective that, hey, man, if I did this and I changed this, this would just make everybody's lives easier, including your suppliers. But then you have to go and renegotiate every contract. You're just like, in the current situation, there's a lot of times you're just like, oh, the hell with that. I'll just forget it. We're going to make unoptimal now. This is the boat we're on. Let's do it. And that's bad. And it leads to predictable consequences, I would say.
I do want to talk about, so you hit on something there around vertical integration, and this is something I really want to spend a bit of time on because all three of you guys are building companies that can be characterized as ones where the factory is the product, right, to take that famous Elon saying. And I mean, the bureaucracy piece is certainly one of those, and being able to design that organizational structure from the ground up. I'm curious, what are the other considerations around, because it is much harder in many ways. So, but it's a model of company we see a lot in areas like manufacturing, like defense, like aerospace. So I'm curious, what do you see as the reasons for doing this, aside from that organizational culture piece, like from a technology perspective, from a sales perspective? How do you think about that?
I can hit this one. So we think about vertical integration is to control schedule, because if you look back at when America was crushing it in the Apollo era, we got to the moon quick. We can't go back to the moon decades later at the same speed that we did when a computer was the size of the room and they're hand soldering discrete components onto a board. How is that possible? But a large part of it is because to do engineering of anything difficult or manufacturing of anything difficult is a completely unreasonable request to have your engineers just sit down and design the perfect system through analysis the first time through. The first design is complete crap, and you're going to do it again. And so the only thing that's important is optimizing for pace of learning. Vertical integration can allow you to go so much faster because everybody's incentives are now aligned to the speed that you want, especially in development. And a lot of times what happens in traditional aerospace is your supply chain, when you're not vertically integrated, I mean, hell, you'll get a new rev of your whatever design. It'll be a year or 2 years. Well, how can you learn? And how can you say, oh, I made a mistake and I'd like to undo it without a 2-year penalty? You can't. And so this is why everything has got it's not one traditional aerospace program is behind schedule and over budget. It's they all are. It's not because the people are bad or stupid. It is because they work in a process that's just fundamentally broken. And vertical integration, in my mind, to control schedule is just what you have to do. Because in the Apollo era, they would test things they would launch multiple rocket flights a day to test. You don't see that anymore. SpaceX is getting back to that level of a frequency, but we had that decades ago. So you have to have iterative speed. That is what's most important. And unfortunately, when you look at our adversaries, I'm sorry, I'll use the word adversaries to describe China. I think they, well, anyway, scratch that. But
is that controversial?
I don't think so. But I don't want to be canceled.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, worry about that.
Yeah, the new generation cancels people.
I'd rather be cancelled by the generation than by cancelled in the real world.
The best part about being old is you no longer care. But so when you look at from an adversarial perspective, China, North Korea, Iran, they can't afford to do aerospace the way the U.S. does aerospace. One of the best things that could ever happen to them is they get wealthy enough, they're God, we've got to do it like the Americans, and they do that, and they just destroy their ability to go fast. But right now, they're doing, they approach aerospace the same way the U.S. did in the 60s, and they're kicking our butt. They're going much faster. And that's what we have to bring back to the U.S., in my opinion.
At least for us, one of the big theses for our company is no one bothered to put software engineers in manufacturing for 40 years. Big macro statement. And by proxy, all the software is terrible. And it's such a complex domain that one of the reasons why all software in manufacturing is bad as a SaaS vendor is because the context you need from the customer is so deep that almost every SaaS company builds the wrong product because no one has context. So the counterexample for that is if I gave anyone in this room a couple of software engineers and you interviewed 10 HR managers and said, build an employee paperwork onboarding workflow. You've all been onboarded as employees, you kind of naturally get it. You might get it right or wrong. But manufacturing's been such a hidden problem for such a long time that for vertical integration for us it just means that, one, it's the only way to build the correct system and software because you're really feeling the right problem and pain. You're solving the correct issue, not the one that you think is an issue from an interview, which might be actually 6 layers deep. And then the rapid iteration, if it's like we ship something, or one of our rules is automate as operate, which is like you can't build software for the factory until you can run that part of the factory yourself. So you end up with no product managers because you've just got engineers automating things, and there's some chaos there. But that was literally the only way to build the systems that would allow us to scale and actually build automation that works in the real world versus like a cool industrial robot that people buy and put on the shelf. It's a context problem, and you got to own your own pain to kind of push all that context into the people that can actually fix the problem.
I love that phrase, own your own pain. That's 100% true. You can't design something and think it's great if you don't get to go use it and determine that it's complete crap, which most of the time, the earlier versions are complete crap, let's be honest. But if you don't actually experience that yourself, you don't fix it. You don't know how to fix it.
Yeah, this is what Boeing used to do with their, when they first invented autopilot for landings. On the 3 last test flights, they just made all the chief engineers who built the autopilot software go on all the test flights. Like, that's the best bug fixing process in the world. And that's what you get with like too many layers removed. It just doesn't work.
I think to just put a point on this topic. So for us, it's like we need to be the fastest and highest quality contract manufacturer. We look at like what software, what solutions are out there. And that's why like we're a very interesting kind of problem to solve, because we realize that like the design of wire harnesses is also incredibly fucked up. And so when we get like Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides from some of like the largest companies out there and have to tell them they're designing it wrong, this thing won't work, that's like a huge problem in this industry too. So I think you have to figure out like kind of what Chris says, like what is the problem and like how are you going to solve it? And then ultimately there's not a lot of SaaS software solutions that are readily available. Like as a previous SpaceX employee, we built a lot of software internally because we're solving our own problems, and it's just incredibly important on that side of it too.
Yeah, so you all touched on software there, and one of the ways I've heard, particularly Hadrian described, is it's 5 SaaS companies and then they built their own customer too, and they just sell it to themselves. And I'm curious, like, sometimes there's this misconception that companies like your guys's are not software companies because you are primarily building physical products and running physical processes. I'd love to have you guys comment on that and talk a little bit about especially the internal tools that you guys have built, the where in these processes that you can apply that software leverage, and how that leads to a better, faster, cheaper process overall.
Sure. I don't know if this is contrarian anymore, but selling SaaS software to hard tech companies is almost impossible. Like, it's very, very difficult because it's always going to be like a unicorn solution. I agree that we are like the way Senra makes money or like revenue is because we sell like a physical product, because that's what the world needs more of, versus just another, some of these other SaaS tools as well. I think the second thing that might be a little contrarian is like software is not going to solve all your problems. Sometimes writing it on a Post-it note and giving it to the person next to you is going to be a faster and scalable process than having all the software overhead that makes things more and more complicated. There's plenty of stories, even at SpaceX, where tons of software engineers put their time and effort into something, and it's like, yeah, it took 3 clicks, but there was also millions of dollars spent, or like a really, really difficult and complex process. I think the way software helps manufacturing companies for us is like the goal for every venture capital backed company is to be scalable. And so we can run a really, really great wire harness shop, which started in my apartment, which we were really efficient because it was 0 salary and only making revenue like myself. But that's not a very efficient and scalable way to do it. And I think the other thing too is that you want to be able to like, at least in our model, to like I call like the McDonald's approach, which is like if you want to work at McDonald's within an hour, you could start flipping burgers and start building something, and that just goes from just being able to like look at a screen and just execute, versus all the manufacturing companies I've worked at, from large companies like Ford to smaller companies, like it is going to take you months and almost years to be just like really skilled in a craft and actually know what the hell you're doing. And so I think that's the whole like plug and play and scalable model that I think software is really, really important, especially in the hard tech industry too.
I couldn't have said it better. The reason why we have 5 software companies is because there's 2 big problems to solve in autonomous manufacturing. One is the task layer, which is like someone takes 40 hours to do something, make it 2 hours. And the second one is the like coordination layer. And we don't believe in full automation. What we do all across the company is take a 40-hour task down to 2 hours and then make the 2-hour task in software so that it's de-skilled enough that we can train anyone in 30 days. And that's the only way to build fast enough. And you also get a really resilient workforce and stuff where it's manufacturing, it's really complicated. The software is never going to tell you exactly every single thing to do. It's going to tell you to flip a burger, but if like the fryer falls over, like you got to do something about it. The other thing, and probably why we're going to win this market, is every single deep tech company in the history of trying to automate manufacturing has looked at the 4 to 10 big stages of really expensive labor or coordination across a factory system, whatever product you're trying to build, and said, this is too aggressive. I'm going to build one of these bits first and then venture capital my way, and eventually I'll build all 5 of them. And it doesn't work. So one, I think we had the right culture, but secondly, you literally just have to build 6 products simultaneously at a ludicrously aggressive pace. Otherwise, you end up with a system where like the front end is really, really efficient, but the backside is really inefficient, or you haven't built that muscle and you're 4 years deep into scaling and you get up to 20 million in revenue and like it's too complicated and the process is too complicated and you've never built that muscle. So one is, there are so many problems in manufacturing that have real cost and schedule and quality ROI that you have. And by the way, when I'm talking about scarce labor, I'm talking to like some of these roles we hired 20 experts from manufacturing and then ran out of talent in the entirety of LA. Like it's that scarce. So part of the automation is just there aren't. If you want the growth curve to go like that, you can't automate it. But the big thing for us of like full stack is we literally had to build everything because there was no off-the-shelf software, and if you don't, you end up with like a half-baked thing, which is like a really tough thing to get started. But once you've got it going, it's kind of like the only way to do it, is what I would say, if you agree with that.
I definitely agree. I think maybe it's a little bit of a tangent, but like for anyone who's starting a hard tech company, like the best process is to just define it versus just trying to figure it out at some point. Because I think one thing that we maybe made a little bit of mistakes on is like we thought software would solve all our problems from day one, and just the Post-it note Excel spreadsheets is sometimes the way to first start it, and then continue to like develop that into your whole workflow eventually too.
Chris, one thing you touched on there is the users of the software you develop are often employees of Hadrian, and there's there's this dynamic there. Then because you're doing everything vertically integrated, you have in your case machinists and software engineers, and roboticists and so on, all working in one organization. And that's like I think in many ways that's a non-trivial like cultural and organizational problem or not problem, but like an organizational, like a unique aspect of Hadrian as a company, and particularly as a venture-backed company. Can you talk a little bit about, and this goes for all of you guys, can you talk a little bit about bringing all those different disciplines together under one roof?
It's extremely complicated, and an example is like, so there are, I think, 5 distinct cultures at Hadrian. One is, call it Silicon Valley software engineers, our technician base, which are going to be the largest and most important part of our company over a long period of time, kind of expert manufacturers, like very technical experts in machining or quality or whatever, and then kind of everyone else. And what you want to do as a leader of a company is say, we're all running in the same direction, right? But often that has clashing incentives. So if it comes out of the CEO's mouth like, hey, your job is to automate everything, immediately everyone's like, and people in manufacturing have been burnt for 20 years by really bad bosses, really bad leadership of like, you're going to lose your job. If I make you more efficient, I'm going to fire you. So like there's this huge 30-year buildup of like, oh, I really hate everything about this. But we started from day one with like a culturally equal footing and then an economic equal footing. And a really dumb example of that is most people get paid hourly. To the extent that California allows me to, everyone is on a salary, and if you're one of those manufacturing people who are helping operate and develop software, you have the same equity bar as like a software engineer. And because we're growing so fast, like you're never going to lose your job unless you're underperforming, but we really had to build the kind of level set economics and the culture from day one. And the culture from day one was, and this is the biggest mistake private equity in Silicon Valley makes. And the private equity version of this is, you wear camo pants and I wear a suit, so screw you, I know what you're doing. And the Silicon Valley version of that is just slightly more autistic, which is I have a PhD, I know what I'm doing. And both completely disrespect the core of manufacturing, which is there's nothing new that needs to be invented here. You just you got to pick 10 smart people and get the knowledge out of their heads from 30 years of experience and get it into software and like scale the hell out of it. But we knew that coming in, but it's a constant fight, and every communication move you make has to continually, reinforce that. But yes, it's the best magic trick, which is every bit of our org design is focused around, it might actually be inefficient for other companies, but what it gets is like, you're the head of machining and I'm the head of software. We actually get hired and fired together if both of us win or lose together economically, culturally, like who's doing a bad job, or like either you're not operating my software correctly, or like we had the wrong discussion, and it just has to start from day one. And if you don't build that from the start, and we're really lucky that we did, it's almost impossible. And this is why change management in manufacturing is so hard, is because you got, an executive running around on a plant floor of 1,000 people, and they're like, you've never run this machine. Like, why would I listen to your idea? And you got to build that from day one. And people often ask me, what's the core most valuable thing about Hadrian? I actually think it's, whether it's faster or slower than I would like, I think we're probably the only company in the US that can actually build automation for manufacturing at scale and get it working on the ground floor. And it comes down to really little things. It's like not just the executive of that operating division, like machining or quality, is giving product feedback. There is at least 2 to 3 literally hourly workers or experts that have to use that software yelling at a software engineer being like, your product isn't good enough, across the whole company. And it's the little things like that that actually like generate the engine that kind of build that cultural and economic muscle that the kind of magic trick works. And if you don't embed that from the start, I have not seen another way to do it.
It does seem like kind of a version of own your pain, but I actually think that like when you're putting in software or any kind of automation, like you can go too far too fast and just create like more process and work, especially like if you're just taking something out of the box and trying to like shoehorn it into your business, and then productivity is down and everybody's miserable. And I think that like one of the things that we're trying to do is actually look at from like a efficiency, productivity aspect. Where would I start first? Because we're at least in the blessed position, like no matter how inefficient we could possibly be, the government would pay the bill. But which isn't the case for poor Chris here, who doesn't have that advantage. But that's not a company goal. So, but we're looking at, like you bring in like software and automation where it helps, that has the most impact, and then you fine tune that so it's not like painful. Yeah. I previously did sales, and like I'll say something. Salesforce can just like absolutely kill your productivity if you're in sales. You're like, this is like I went from something that I could like put down into like some system I had in like 3 clicks, and now I'm like, my left finger is tired. It's just like click, 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 click. And you can do the same on the manufacturing floor in terms of automation and productivity, where you like increase the time and inefficiency. But at the end of the day, like to get to scale and to quality, like the ability to like automatically know like what lot did something come from, where are all the quality pictures, bringing all that up automatically and having a system do that, incredibly important. But that might be hard to put in place like instantly, and you're going to iterate through it. So I think always making sure that you're doing an appropriate level, and then looking at where's the next best spot for me to like increase my efficiency and productivity is certainly how we're looking at it.
There's a line that says, if you want to get something done, give it to a lazy person. And so I think I am very happy I'm kind of a lazy person, because I think in manufacturing you really have to do the least amount of steps and the least amount of work to get something done while also not deterring from the quality. I think the culture at Senra is that our best technicians, the people actually building the stuff, they're not going to actually say what's a better process. If you watch it in and out and you see someone they're cranking through those potatoes and putting it on the fryer, like their whole goal is to not get fired and to go as fast as possible. It's really on the manufacturing engineering team that like when I'm, politely saying we need to get this build from, 1 week to, 1 day, what are all the inefficiencies that you like kind of watch this technician, or you watch it or examine the time studies from there. Because at the end of the day, people just want to put their head down from like the labor force side and get it done. And it's really kind of almost us as like a customer or the user saying we need to do the least amount of steps. So even at SpaceX, we did a time study, and most people like wire harnessing, which you guys are learning today, is a very labor-intensive part. There's no like machines or tools to actually do it. About like 40% of the process of just a technician was just looking at a computer and figuring out what the hell should I do and like reading specifications. And if you took someone not from a manufacturing, not from a data-driven side, you would say, oh, we should like buy this machine and have it do this, or like we should like there's tons of other things on that side of it too, but it's really like looking at what is taking the longest and overall like non-value add labor. And that's like how I think software can like really effectively change kind of like any manufacturing flow. But there's also just it ends up getting the bits and atoms, and there's only so fast you can get, but you always have a human element to it. But how do you get it so anyone off the street can do it versus the person I've known for 30 years been doing it too. So
There's a word that's come up a couple times now in this conversation, and that's scale. And I think intuitively, that word gets thrown around a lot in Silicon Valley culture, but I think intuitively, people understand that with the kinds of processes that you guys are building, like a lot of the gains are fully realized at scale, and there are huge advantages to scale. There's like different models of models of this that you see around like scaling up versus scaling out, kind of like more modular approaches and so on and so forth. But I would love to hear, how you guys think about scale, how you guys think about the future of your companies as it relates to scale, and what do Senra, Hadrian, and Castellion look like as manufacturing operations at scale?
I think for us, like, we have a never-ending customer base, and it always hurts me as a founder to say no to work because we don't have the capacity or at the time to do it too. I think what the scaling part of it is like I want to be able to help every single customer, and I think you have to scale with like machines, automation, and a cheap labor force ultimately in manufacturing. Right now, I think a lot like people ask me like, what's the best wire harness factory in the world? And it honestly is not a contract manufacturer. It's like a SpaceX or a Boeing or someone else who like vertically integrate into their shop, can pay people a little bit more because it goes into their end product, and be able to like kind of handhold the whole process. But like this is kind of a strange analogy, but I don't know if you guys know that like one or two families in your neighborhood who have like 14 kids, but like they don't just scale by getting more nannies. They scale by having like all the older siblings take care of the younger siblings. And I think that's like a kind of a crazy model to think about, but it's important where you shouldn't scale with just like more manufacturing engineers and more software engineers. Like there needs to be a plateau where it's like, yeah, the sustaining portion of it, but like the skilled technicians are training the underskills or the apprentice technicians, or the software engineers are making their applications more stable on that side of it too. But scaling is the ultimate factor because you're able to service more customers, and that's where you're going to find where everything breaks. But like I'm terrified and excited when like Senra has to make their next factory, because we're doing that on purpose, where like you don't keep it under one building. You kind of have to like break the training wheels off too.
Yeah, so we're in a little bit different position because what scale looks like for us is like, well, how many guided missiles will the U.S. buy in a year? It's actually a published number for the most part. You can actually look it up on the internet. But it's not as many as you would think. Like a large order would be like 1,000 a year. And, compared to like almost any other manufacturing industry, like that's a joke of a number. And so what we have to like look at very carefully is like, well, what do we invest in to get to a scale that the government will buy this year or may buy in a few years? But it's not like the same problem I would suspect that these guys have, where they want to do millions, billions of parts. Like, and we don't have a market for that. And so there are different choices that we'll make, because you don't necessarily put in the expenditure to drive your manufacturing system to the utmost best efficiency, because the capital cost of like implementing that would be so high you would actually raise your cost of goods sold on like a unit quantity of 1,000. So we actually have to try to look at where that balance is. And I think where like traditional aerospace does this horribly is like when they're developing something new, they make a bunch of decisions to actually say, well, I'm only building like 1 or 2 or 5 prototypes during this development, and they make a ton of design and manufacturing choices of like how they'll build those prototypes. And then it's like, okay, you get to the end of that, and it works, and the government's like, okay, I want to buy some. They're like, whoa, we can't do like 50. That's crazy. Like this is impossible. We only like made this to build 5. And fundamentally, they built the wrong product. They demonstrated the wrong thing. And so we try to look at it from the other example of always holding the quantity of what we're going to build in mind as we're designing it. I think that's absolutely critical because we do want to actually be able to scale up to hit a rate that they would desire to buy. But it's also more thoughtful than just saying, I want to go for unlimited quantity and the hell of the cost, it's going to it'll get paid back to us eventually, because that's not necessarily true in our case. So it's an interesting balance.
Yeah, I think for us, the analogy I would use is software can grow fast because the cost of replicating something is I don't know, apart from the AWS costs, you can give it to a customer pretty cheaply. I would say everything that we build is built for scale, not in the sense of overbuilding systems or anything like that. It's just you got to get it as close to order comes in and order goes out, and your only problem is market share and growth and stuff. And because there's so much complexity in manufacturing, that is a tall order. But this is why manufacturers don't scale, is because everything is a human's brain getting the job done. So that's how we think about it, is every single error or process handover or whatever is it slows the growth curve down because it just causes friction in the whole system.
I actually think that's a great point. It's while we think about scale of okay, it can't be too much for the product, how do you scale your engineering talent? How do you make sure your 1,000th employee is as productive as your 50th? Which, if you've noticed, generally it starts to go down till you get to a certain company size, and you could add infinite people, and you'll probably get less work done. How do you actually scale that? That's I think one of the toughest aspects of running a business is figuring that out, doing it correctly.
We're coming up on the tail end of our time here before we open it up to questions, and I want to bring it back to a very similar place to where we started, around the big picture of geopolitics and the future of the industrial base and how those two things fit together. Brian, you have on your website the phrase "peace through deterrence," and we talked, a little bit about how what Castellion is building is a non-nuclear deterrent. But I would love to get your thoughts on how our production capacity and how the manufacturing processes that you guys are building, that as a part of our industrial base, how does that function as a deterrent?
Yeah. So the stat that Chris said earlier about basically if we go to fight against China, we're going to have weapons for 3 days and then we're out. Are you scared of that? You're just okay, I got to survive the first 3 days, and if I do that, then we've won. And so when you look at industrial capacity, I mean, you're not. It's not just a soundbite. It's literally what keeps the country safe and keeps the ability for the country to do all these other things that have nothing to do with not only industrial power or military superiority, but if you want to become an artist, well, how many artists do you see in extremely oppressive regimes? Probably less than here. And I think to take care of the democracy, you have to actually have the strength in both the military strength, economic strength, cultural strength, industrial strength. You have to have all of them. We're focused on actually enabling, through an industrial kind of renaissance, which is what I think a lot of the hard tech companies these days are actually trying to do. We're focused on obviously a product that helps our military strength, but that fundamentally keeps everything else in the economy humming along. Because if you don't have that, the U.S. is on top for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is that a lot of countries would be stupid to mess with us. So we get to do a lot of things and enjoy a lot of privilege in terms of other strengths that you wouldn't have without military strength. And so we're losing that. We've done a bad job of managing that. And I think there's probably a good phrase hard times lead to, anyway, but there's a
something
yeah,
forth turning,
I won't go through the whole
something.
thing. It's also sexist. It's all about men, but that's not fair. But I think looking towards the future, it's completely fixable. We have everything we need to bring this back. You just have to actually care and focus on it and get back to the basics. And I think the good news is I feel like people have woken up to this is really a problem and are actually willing to invest time and energy and effort to do something about it.
So you can ask.
Chris, and this is a question for all of you guys, but Chris, we spoke on the a16z podcast about 2 years ago, and a little over 2 years ago, and we discussed how fragile this ecosystem is, and especially, the average age of a machinist is 55. It's probably higher now, I would imagine. And even the one and those are the ones that supply most of the primes with their parts. How would you describe have there been any changes since then? In the 2 years since, and I know 2 years is a very short amount of time in what in the areas we're talking about. But have you observed any kind of vibe shift in the ecosystem?
The vibe shift in state, DoD, and Congress is so 2 years ago everyone was talking about procurement cycles and why can't the government buy products. At least over the last 12 months, everyone is oh crap, we could buy all the products we want, but there is no production capacity across shipbuilding, munitions, vehicles, whatever, which is very good, because at least now we're talking about what I think is the right problem. On everything else, honestly, not really. It gets worse every month. To give you a statistic, there is something just in shipbuilding, just at Huntington Ingalls, and by the way, China is building I think 20 to 50 times more, I'm going to get this statistic wrong, more ships than us every year. And to give you a personal story as an Australian who moved here 5 years ago, if the US Pacific Fleet cannot defend Australia's trade lanes, the country runs out of food in 27 days and runs out of oil and gas in 60 days. To your point around resiliency, it's what is how rich is this country, and how much do all of us in the room not have to deal with the problems of bad guys or geopolitics? And the answer is we have Coachella and Burning Man. It's the most ridiculous safety abstraction of welfare, artistry, whatever you want to call it. And it's such an insanely rich country, but what you get is 70% of the people in the country have never been in a bar fight or had to do something really hard or paved a road or whatever, and we're just living in this crypto fantasy land. But anyway, the macroeconomic picture gets worse every day because people get older and the replacement rate just isn't anywhere near catching up. The good news is, I think over the last 12 months, there's been a real vibe shift to oh shit, it's not just about buying products, it's about capability, capacity. And the analogy I keep using is 12 months ago we were talking about we need more Netflixes, and now everyone's talking oh, we don't have any data center capacity at all. That's the kind of proxy I would say from a software perspective. So the problem gets worse, which is a company, good. For the amount of sleep I get at night, bad. But I think there's more people attacking the problem, which is a really good thing, but I don't think it's going anywhere near fast enough.
So I just realized that Mad Max is a documentary of after day 30 when they've run out of food, but before day 60 when everybody has gas. So that was eye-opening.
Yeah?
All right, I want to open it up. Actually, any closing comments from any of you guys before we open it up to the floor for questions?
I think that the closing comment is there's another phrase when you're fed, you're not hungry, and I think this is why we don't build things fast enough in the U.S. and why Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin built the first fighter jet in 143 days, which is insane, and I don't think anyone in this country can do that's fast enough. But I think there's going to be a wake-up call in the next few years, especially when defense and the labor shortage actually becomes more and more serious. And we might sound like the crazy people up here that's the sky's falling down. But especially in my line of work, kind of what Chris was saying is we've tapped out the most skilled wire harness technicians in the LA area, and it is really, really difficult to start scaling that. And we're tackling one of the most difficult problems too. But I think it's, if we don't do it now, who's going to do it 30 years later? So.
If anyone in the audience is interested in a career shift to becoming a wire harness technician, you know who to talk to.
Good job.
So I think we can open it up to the floor for questions from the audience.
Also, just because Chris was calling this out, this was a stat from 2022. In 2022, the United States had 5 large ocean-going commercial ships on order, compared to 1,794 such ships in China, 734 in South Korea, 587 in Japan, and 319 in Europe. One additional stat, the United States hasn't accounted for more than 5% of global new ship tonnage since 1960. So that's like 6 decades ago. Okay, so that, as Oliver said, we're opening it up to questions for any of the panelists. I'm going to start with folks in the front, so thanks for sitting in the front. Here we go.
Thank you so much. In defense, which was traditionally cost plus and all the inefficiencies associated with that, now with the change towards a more conventional model where startups are need to make economic sense and just free market, what's that change been like on ground, going from cost plus to?
Well, okay. When you talk about a shift from cost plus, they have shifted maybe 0.5% to 1% of the budget. Like what shift are you? I mean, it gets talked about a lot, but there's really been no shift yet of any meaningful dollars in comparison to the budget. I will say that obviously, I don't necessarily think that people are on a cost plus contract and they're just like, how do we run this up? Most people don't think like that. Some of them actually do. But incentives always drive your behavior. And of course, when all your costs are paid for and you get something that works, and even though you're like, man, this process sucks and it's horribly inefficient, you stop working on it because why? You actually would make less profit, and there's just nobody even the government is like, well, I don't really want to keep spending non-recurring engineering to make the process more efficient. Whereas with a firm fixed price contracting model, if you can become more efficient as the company, you can literally put the rest of the dollars in your pocket and do better. And then the next time you bid, you're able to bid lower. So incentives do drive behavior, even though I would say that it's not necessarily complete evil, but it's definitely not helping. And there's been no shift.
Is there a shift?
No.
Coming up?
I mean, okay, so take this as an example. SpaceX just kicked Boeing's butt left, right, center. And Boeing's lesson from that experience on Starliner was not, oh man, we should look at our engineering processes and how we do complex hardware development. It was, I'm not going to take firm fixed price contracts ever again. Does that sound like a shift?
All right, I know we had one over here.
Thank you for this conversation. It was very eye-opening. Taking it back to the macro, it really sounds like this is a multifaceted issue, right? Misaligned incentives, the U.S. may be resting on its laurels, getting too comfortable. I wanted to ask about the role of culture and media to shine more light, on this issue, and how do you guys see that? For example, this is the first time I'm hearing about, the problems we have here, and so great, we have a podcast that'll, broadcast this information, but just curious to hear if you guys have any thoughts on, culturally and maybe even from a media perspective, what could be done to just really get more people to understand the gravity of these issues.
I'll hit this, and I'm going to hand Chris the mic because I know he's like, why'd they take my mic? I'm going to beat on media for a second, but when you look at media in the 60s, there used to be technical depth. They didn't treat you like an absolute moron. They actually dug into details matter, in most complex things. I can't accurately turn it into a 5-word headline. Well, of course you can't. It's complex. This isn't elementary school, and media doesn't do that anymore. And we got some dissent, and I'm happy to actually hear that opinion. But I think mainstream media rarely digs into the issues on the details at enough depth to actually inform your opinion. And most of the time, especially from my experience, having been dragged through the mud on certain issues in the media, the details of what they put in there are actually wrong. And then once you realize that, you're like, well, why do I listen to any details? Because they're probably also wrong over there too. And I think that part of that is driven by the market. they're not going for clickbait because they want to not go in depth, and like traditional media is not like suffering heavily because it's because of like what everybody here wants to consume on their phone in like 3 seconds in like a whatever format you enjoy. And I think that that's driven like media to go places that are not necessarily healthy for us as a country because they're just responding as a incentivized player in the space. But I would actually love to hear the opinion.
Yeah, John, do you want to hear anything? Sure, let's go for it. Hi, I'm Maggie Lane. I'm a screenwriter. I'm also a member of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which facilitates technology and scientists as well in Hollywood and media. Things like foundation, things like even you have to understand that we're consulting with scientists all day long. I'm a former development executive for Peter Jackson's Weta, and every time we're building something, and I've done specs, we are looking at the technology. We have real engineers and real people that are building things. You look at Avatar, a lot of that technology, I know it seems kind of crazy, but the way we're looking at ships, this is not thrown about. Stanley Kubrick had the iPad, a proto-iPad in 2001: A Space Odyssey. You can look at it, and Apple has actually shown it in court. If we are not trying to create technology in media, there is no room left to dream, and there is no room left to fantasize about what technology can look like. And if you look at anything Elon Musk is doing, Black Mirror did it like 5 years ago. So it's really, really important. And also, again, to plug the Science and Entertainment Exchange, but I've worked with physicists, I've worked with scientists, engineers, and we are taking it very seriously as screenwriters. And I think that the biggest mistake you can make in media, not to throw you over the coals here a bit, if you assume your audience is stupid, they will leave you and depart. I'm sorry, have you seen Shogun? All the characters? Game of Thrones? It's complicated. People are following it and love it. So never underestimate your audience.
Yeah, and I think that's actually completely fair because when I was saying media, I meant more like news, and I wish they put as much effort into it as you were doing, because as a fellow physicist, when like a helicopter tips forward to like, you know, kill James Bond but doesn't move forward, you're like, well, that's not real. Like, what? Come on. And I'm out of the movie immediately. But honestly, I actually don't think like the level of effort that you're doing of actually hiring experts, I don't feel like that's being done normally, like when you talk about like traditional news media. And in almost any format. And part of it is because like I think that there's a market shift where they can't afford it, but it needs to be done as a country because, yes, people are smart if you give them the actual data to make their own opinion.
Would you be interested in advising for TV and film?
I mean, yeah, sure. Like I'm a face for TV, clearly.
I want to hear Chris's take, and then we'll go on to the next one.
Okay, so I'll actually not get canceled here.
Your team can review the recording before anything goes live.
Okay, this is a very complicated problem because there is no yes, there is a media industry and we're talking about the news. But I also think TV and film is really important because, in the 80s, this is actually extremely important for defense. A lot of the movies that got created were influenced by the CIA. They just were. And that's why you see, all of the bad guys in, Rambo and shit were Russian. Okay. So now you got to think about, what are we sending into our kids' heads? And the answer is a big chunk of it is influence propaganda from competitive nations. It just flat out is. Not in hardcore science and TV. I think Foundation was great. I also really liked, what was the other one? They went to the moon. It was an alternate history space race one. Yeah. Right. It's positive. It's uplifting. There's men and women. It's not this very kind of masculine 80s thing. A lot of people get it right, especially in deep content. In the media in general, though, it's a huge problem. The second thing is it's like running a big company, and you can do two things. One is leadership, and then the second one is context, right? If you ask me how I would go advise people at Boeing, and I think they're doing this, is you hire an engineer and they do nothing but expect things on the factory floor for months. That's how you change the culture. I think in this country, it's really difficult because we have two generations stacked on top of each other. One was like the boomer generation where everything was so easy and they kind of stole from the system. And now you've got a whole generation of Americans where what you got told was like, you work hard, you get a college degree, or you do these things and you're going to have a great life. And you get told that there is no inflation. You get told that there is no like problems with the country. Everything's going great. And your ground floor reality is like, all my friends are struggling. I'm kind of depressed. Like, people are poorer than they used to be. I can't buy a house. Like, what the hell is going on? And we've just like really lost that connection to mission, spirit, whatever happens to be. And there are only two ways to solve this at scale. This is like a controversial statement, but it's true. And I'm not saying either of these are solutions to the US. One is, how do you solve this multi-generational like mission kind of problem? There are only two ways to do it at scale. That you can observe in history. One is martial doctrine, which is basically you make the elites' 15-year-old sons fight barbarians at the front, and they make slightly better decisions if they're senators. The second way you solve the problem is like with very deep religious doctrine, because you tell the same stories over and over and over again. Right now in the US, neither of those two things work because we chose to create a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, freedom of speech society, which I agree with. But it's true, but there's no cultural connective tissue, right? And it comes down to like, what do you believe in, and how do you get this message out? And I think one of the biggest mistakes we made, and I'll finish the point here, is we told everybody that if you worked in manufacturing or you had a blue-collar job in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you were like shamed by the government, your peers, like whatever. And therefore, you don't get these discussions where you're like at a bar with your friends and someone's in finance and someone's in manufacturing and they can talk about the problems and it percolates. And, you know, it's like not up to me to tell people in the important. We just have to get more people in it and solving the problem. And I think it'll happen naturally. But it's a really gnarly issue. That wasn't the best answer of all time, but that is, I think, the majority of the truth of it.
Can I just make a quick point?
Please, go for it.
Just more on the culture side, I think going with what Chris says, like, it is not sexy to work in manufacturing. Like, I'm in this room, it's like we got kombucha and we got nice like pastries. Like, I used to work for like one of the largest automotive manufacturers. You had to buy your own coffee there. Like, isn't that crazy? Like, and it's just this culture and like going low in the media. Like, I don't know why this came top of mind, but like, you watch 8 Mile, like the Eminem movie, and like you just see how hard Eminem's working in this factory and like how terrible it is, and then he's rapping on the side. Like, it's just like, poor Eminem, like he has to be in this factory making automotive parts. Like, and I've had to feel it too. Like, I love manufacturing, and I was always kind of like the ugly duckling almost too. And it's like, I think there needs to be this like, if you graduate college now, I think the goal is really like, how can you make the most money in tech, get like a high 6-figure salary, work the least amount of hours, and I think you might look good on paper, but trust me, your mental health will probably be a little bit off. But like, you make maybe a little less, work in something that's like actually building a product, and like you get to see it out the door, or like get to see it in the news. I think that's just like the most empowering thing too. So, yeah.
I have one follow-up there for you specifically, Jordan. Oliver mentioned this at the beginning, wire harnesses on planes. Why isn't there a front-page article about these $10,000 wire harnesses that every airline manufacturer has to use? Like, why don't we know more about this stuff?
What?
Bad PR.
I think it's just really easy to deflect the problem. I mean, if you ask like a airplane manufacturer or Boeing, like, lower the cost of your wire harnesses, they're going to say, great, we're going to need hundreds of millions of dollars to redesign it or qualify new vendors or anything like that too. So they're going to easily deflect the problem. And we are the only venture capital-backed wire harness manufacturing company and design company, and we're the only ones that like trying to prove this or make this a lot better system. But it goes back to my point, like, when you're fed, you're not hungry. Like, I think right now it's like everyone's at a buffet and you're going to try to eat as much as possible, but like, what if you just got that one dish and that's all you get to eat? And so I think this is going back to the point is like, Senra can probably make that cheaper. Not only that, we can also tell Boeing, this is how you should design it. Like, head of Boeing supply chain came to my facility and was like, we had 1,500 design issues on a Boeing plane for just wire harnessing itself. I was like, I could probably fix every one of those issues because I'm an expert in this field. But it's just who's pushing it? Like, who's pushing the, like, do better? And unfortunately, like, it's the reason why we all go to workout classes. Someone can yell at us, and we run really fast on a treadmill. But right now, no one has that workout instructor that's telling them to, push themselves.
Great. We're a little over time, so we'll do maybe one more. You guys okay with that? I know you had one up here.
So with the talent expiring right now in manufacturing, Meta has obviously announced, Air glasses. You see a lot of different compute mechanisms that are changing the way we are going to experience both technology and jobs. Just curious to know what your role in spatial computing you think will be in manufacturing and how that will impact kind of future generations as far as either inviting newer people to actually be a part of the process. Obviously, it sounds like you're going towards more total autonomous, kind of processes, but I think there has to be some type of human involvement where instead of waiting a year for someone to get trained, maybe spatial computing can actually ramp that up much faster. I would love to get your take as far as the relevance of it.
Do you want to know why it's not going to happen? OSHA and the unions. You can't roll it out. It doesn't. Unless someone gets rid of 20 years worth of regulations. People have tried this. It's literally regulatorily illegal because you run into all sorts of safety issues. We do a lot of spatial stuff in AI, and I think the core point here is, and we are just starting to add true AI to our systems now, and we do a little bit of spatial computing stuff, but the core thing is that there is no labeled data set for any of this. So part of the big value of us building all these systems out is because we're the only ones with the labeled data set, and we can actually start throwing models at it now after 3.5 years. With spatial computing, yes, there's actually a lot of stuff in Boeing that they're doing like XR and VR for, which is like, here's exactly where you should plug the hole and you don't have to read a sheet of paper. That stuff is actually really valuable. At scale, though, a lot of it is, there are like 10 to 12 of these vendors that pop up and try and push this into manufacturing, and most of them die because they end up running into safety regulations where you can't. You're not allowed to do it. Yeah.
One more, front row.
So the problem that each of you keep describing about like the OS is essentially like we're full, so we're not hungry. It feels so systemic, and it feels like almost insurmountable. Do you feel like we need some sort of tipping point or like scary event that kind of mobilizes us to all change how we operate in this country, or do you think that there's a path to just continuing doing what you're doing and like really making this deep systemic change without absolute tragedy getting in the way first?
Nope. We're going to have to get punched in the face in a big way.
I actually agree with that. Like, America's strength is off the ropes. It's never been just like, dominating the center of the ring the whole time. I would say that like we're trying to be proactive about this before something happens, but like I think like the only way you actually get rid of the regulatory environment, whether it's like government regulatory or internal to your company, like process and bureaucracy, is something like traumatic happening where it's like, if we keep doing this, we've just lost. So I'm going to like start cutting. And there's very few exceptions to that. Like one of the very few is like Elon, cutting process out or cutting people out that are not value add to what they're doing. And that is like such a rare exception. But other than that, like, yeah, it takes something traumatic to happen.
Yeah, Americans are wrong. There's nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is actually fundamentally why, like, like empires, like average age is like usually like a couple hundred centuries and then they fall. It's because that was the time it took to build up a bunch of process that basically just killed them.
Yeah, I agree.
Here we are.
You need to get punched in the face. You need to kind of feel the pain. But I ultimately think like there's going to be a huge shift in the next few years where more people are going to graduate the Ivy League software degrees, and they're not going to get into like Google only needs so many software engineers at some point. And I think there's going to be this like new wave of hard tech. Like we have paying customers. Like typically a lot of our problems in hard tech are like scaling and making it work for financial reasons versus trying to sell the new like app that makes people like talk to their friends and everything too, which is also important. But at the end of the day, like people need purpose and people want to achieve greatness. And I think we're kind of in the right realm of it.
I think that's a great place to end off. Thank you so much, all of our panelists. This was great.
Thank you.